welcome to Sorry, Is This Boring? I'm Marika.
I'm Natalie.
On today's episode, we're going to talk about the film PYEWACKET, giving our personal interpretations, thoughts, and feelings.
Spoiler warning. But if you like spoilers, then I guess that doesn't really matter.
Yeah, we recommend watching this film before you listen to the podcast.
So PYEWACKET is a frustrated, angst-ridden teenage girl awakens something in the woods when she naively performs an occult ritual to evoke a witch to kill her mother.
So I looked up some stuff about the filmmaker. The film is Canadian. It was all shot in Ottawa.
Yeah,
And-
funny thing about that is that when we first watched the movie, Marika was like, "Is this Canadian?" And I was like, "What? I don't know. I don't think so." And then at the end, there was like a little stamp that was like Telefilm Canada or something, and I was like, "How did you know?"
I feel like there's just a Canadian vibe that I am very in tune to.
The Sixth Sense.
A Canadian Sixth Sense. But yes, it's from the writer-director Adam McDonald, and this is his second feature. His first film is also a horror film, and it's like a nature survival horror film called Backcountry. I haven't seen it, but it was also very well received.
Was this movie well received?
This movie was well received, but it didn't become quite widely acclaimed. In Canada it was very well received, but
Things don't seem to make it out of Canada.
yeah. But one thing that was interesting when researching Backcountry is that people said that it was seemed to say it was very similar in feeling to this film, and that it's a really stripped down concept, and it's a very slow burn that's very well done, which I think is this film as well.
I mean, the thing that I definitely love about this film is definitely what you were saying, it being stripped down and slow burn. I think it achieves really well what a lot of horror movies of a similar vibe just do not. And I think there's a lot of stuff that I wrote down that was kind of about that whole concept. I guess the first thing I was thinking about was the color, how it was a really cool toned film.
Mm-hmm.
I feel the whole 2000s and probably beginning of the 2010s was just all about cool toned horror movies.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of started with The Ring. The Ring kind of started that whole trend, and then after that it just seemed like something that was kind of just cool to make your film look like. It seemed like it made it scarier in a way, but it didn't seem to have much motivation. And I feel it works so well in this film, not only because I feel metal music plays a big role in it, and I think a lot of it with this cool dead forest gives it kind of almost a music video-esque vibe. It's kind of playing out the fantasy of what metal music sounds like, and also just sort of being in her head. It's not The Conjuring, where it's a really nice family that moves into a new home, and why is it cool toned, because
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't start out as something that's something dark or something angsty. It's just to make it look like something bad's gonna happen soon,
Yeah.
But for this, you're in this girl's world.
And she's depressed.
Yeah,
And
she's
it's blue.
depressed. Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
I feel that's one thing that I feel really affects your takeaway from the film is whether you think that the camera is a subjective character or an objective character, if that makes sense. Because the whole time, almost 90% of the film were close up on her face. I feel like to me it's like very clearly all subjective, and like the camera hand is like handheld for a lot of it, and then the movements like even like mimic her like emotions of the scene, and the camera's like so much tied to her. It's like an extension of her,
Yeah.
almost the entire film. And so arguably then like everything that you see in the film is not objective, it's subjective. It's like her perspective, which like can bring into doubt the legitimacy of everything you see.
Yeah, definitely. Something I was thinking about was I feel like especially with like the description of the film, you sort of go into it kind of like having like preconceived notions of it. It's this girl that performs an occult ritual to kill her mother. And you're like, how bad is this mom? You know? Like, is she physically abusive? Like, what's going on? And there's something about the way that it unfolds where, like, you sort of know that it wasn't a good idea, but you're kind of, like, with the sort of subjectivity, like, you're with her
Yeah,
when it
you're
happens.
with her the whole way, because I feel like that's like something I was like really paying attention to watching it, was like the depiction of her mother. The first thing like you hear her say in the film is like, I don't care what you do, like just go.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like crying and drinking wine, and she's like, you know, like that's the first thing she says. And then the next thing she says to Leah is, where have you been? After she just said like, I don't give a crap like what you're
Yeah.
doing, just leave me alone, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like you're really set up to like hate her, but then like it's constantly shifting, and it feels like quite true to like real like mother-daughter relationships,
Definitely.
you know.
I feel like there's so many movies that sort of like play out that relationship. Like honestly, like the first one that I could think of, which is kind of like funny to compare it to, is like Lady Bird.
Yeah, I was thinking Lady Bird as well.
Like one thing that always like sticks with me is like that one scene when they're going dress shopping and they're like arguing about something or another, and then the mom holds up this dress and is like, isn't this so cute? And then she's like, oh my god, it's so cute. And it's like everything is just that they were arguing about is just gone, and they've just like sort of had this like short artificial bond over this like one little thing.
Yeah.
And that's like definitely something that this film plays with a lot.
But I think it like really does like, it makes you like kind of hate the mom, like even though you know she's not like awful, because you're so with Leah, you hate her because she's like been cruel to her, and she's like been selfish, and now she's like taking her away from like the only thing that she like has gotten her through the grief of losing her father,
Mm-hmm.
like her friends. And it seems like so unfair, even though like you can
Yeah.
understand the mom's side the whole time, you don't support her, you think she's like, it's kind of awful.
Yeah, and I feel like if it was from the mother's perspective, it would be like such a different film. And you would be like 100% against this child because she kind of like has just as much like a subjective point of view of her as she does her mother. And they're both just like sort of blinded. Their motivations and like their ideas about each other are like so skewed by this loss that's just looming over them.
Yeah. This film like is like a really good example of like grief as horror, and how like it like tragedy like morphs people and relationships, and I feel like it's something that's like, it makes me think of like Hereditary.
Yes, I wrote down something about Hereditary because I feel like sort of the way that the the mother deals with the grief is like very similar to me, where she just gets like so mad at the daughter for like things that like don't really seem to make sense,
Yeah.
but like you know so well like the motivation behind it.
Yeah. And I think like also the thing like that, like the idea of some things you can't unsay, you know. I feel like there's like things like in Hereditary and this film where it's like things, and obviously the things she says about wanting her mom to die, like that can't be unsaid, you know, like the consequences of rage,
Yeah.
and how that they're like, they're everlasting when it comes to relationships.
And like something I really like about this film, you know, you're with Leah the whole time, and so the things that the mother says like carry just as much weight to the viewer. But at the same time, I think that there's something kind of really nice about how the sort of myth of like the monstrous mother is kind of cracked in a way. And I know that we've like talked about the idea of the monstrous mother a lot, but it's kind of a concept that has just been like riddled throughout so many horror films throughout like since horror films beginning.
Yeah.
I guess there's like something that's explored a lot in horror is things familiar becoming horrifying, or things comforting becoming horrifying.
Yeah.
That's why, like, a good example is, like, dolls in horror movies. You know, it's something that comforts you as a child.
Yeah.
And then when it, like, turns against you, when it becomes possessed, it's, like, so much scarier because you, like, rely on that thing for comfort.
Yeah. And I feel like that's something that is, like, in this film is, like, almost reversed. Because, like, at the beginning of the film, the mother is, like, not very motherly at all. And then, like, almost immediately after she, like, performs the curse, to, like, get her mother to die, her mother becomes, like, mothering and sympathetic. She, like, you see her, like, tending to her, like, cut wrist. She's, like, taking care of it, bandaging it, and she apologizes for the first time in the movie. She's like, I'm so sorry for what I said. From this point on in the film, she's, like, apologetic and really, like, listens to Leah and is, like, really nurturing, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like, up until this point, she's been the complete opposite.
Yeah.
And so it's, like, I feel like it is exploring that idea, like, in a much more subtle way, maybe, and, like, sort of, like, a reversed way.
Yeah. Which I think is great because, like, I'm a little bit sick of horror movies that create monsters out of women, you know? And so it's really nice to sort of set it up seeming like this mother is going to be like the death of this child or this teenager, and then it sort of tricks you. But I feel like kind of talking about the sort of shift of the mom's role, I kind of want to get into like the whole thing about like paranoia versus fantasy, because to me that can be read in like two different ways, and I think the whole film itself can be read in two different ways.
Yeah, there's definitely two different takes, and I feel like one thing that I feel like really like is like a really foreshadowing scene is like a scene like right at the beginning when she's like hanging out with her friends after the book signing, I think, or maybe it's before, and he's like, and her friend like reads something from this book that they've all just like gotten signed because they're obsessed with it. It's like an occult book, and he says the devil's role is to expose evil in the hearts of men, is like a quote he reads, and then her friend is talking about parents and how like they're just people too, and it's just kind of like stonery talk, like, and it doesn't seem that important at all, but I feel like it really summarizes like the entire film in that scene.
Yeah, it's
like
totally like the heart of the film.
Yeah, the idea that, you know, parents are flawed.
Yeah, she like says they fuck up, they make mistakes.
And also this idea that the devil's role is to expose evil in the hearts of men. And I feel like that is basically how the film unfolds, like, if you interpret it that way.
Yeah. So, kind of going along that, with kind of the things that we were saying in the beginning with the, just how stripped down and, like, slow burning this film is, it sort of does an amazing job of how everything unfolds after the ritual, in a way that's just like super subtle, and I think works so well. Like, I think that the way that everything plays out and like what's shown to the audience, it works so much better than I feel like so many supernatural horror movies I've seen. One big thing is, like, I know I talk a lot about things I don't like about The Conjuring, but I think the whole universe in general plays along with a lot of tropes that I think don't work anymore, and I think that PYEWACKET is, like, a great contrast to a lot of these tropes. I think that there's not really any jump scares.
Yeah. One thing it does have is transitional sound scares.
Yeah.
But
it's not like a big bang right when something scary comes up.
yeah, it'll be like a noise that transitions into a new scene, like a sound from the next scene, like a sound bridge, and I feel like it can make you jump, you know?
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say that that's a jump scare, because it's just like meant to keep you, like, you know, going.
Yeah, and I think that the sound does, like, a good job of complementing what's shown instead of sort of, like, being emotionally manipulative. And I think another thing that's really effective about it is that the sort of entity in itself is never shown close up. Because I don't really mind when, you know, things aren't super, you know, high quality, either like perfect makeup or perfect CGI. Like, I feel like I can fall into the fantasy of a film, and if there's something that's, you know, you can tell is movie magic, like, it doesn't bother me that much. But I think that there is flaws with showing monsters really close up, because I don't think you need that for something to be scary.
Yeah.
Like, even just thinking about if you were, like, out in the woods and you see something, like, crawling in a way that, like, no human or animal can from, like, 20 feet away from you. It's still so scary.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't need to be right in front of your face to have a terrifying effect.
Yeah, I think it, like, reminds me a lot of, like, the Blair Witch Project in that way, because, like, it's something that was, like, clearly made, like, very, like, economically, and they, like, made it terrifying, you know? They didn't have to show a lot for it to be scary. The small amount that we see PYEWACKET, like, really ties into the idea of paranoia, because it's so subtle, and the idea that, like, everything in the film, like, even, you know, the shadowy depictions of the monster and it crawling around, like, could just be subjective, and it's like her seeing these things that aren't there, you know?
Yeah, which I feel like that totally comes back to the whole fantasy versus paranoia thing, because I believe that the film could totally be read in two different ways, where one, the whole thing is sort of in Leah's head. Like, she immediately regrets using black magic to do something horrible to her mother, especially when, after it happens, her mother seems to really change her tune, you know? Like, she apologizes for the things that she said, she feels remorse, and so, you know, the paranoia totally consumes her. She really feels that she, like,
yeah, I feel like it could totally just be born from her, like, guilt and isolation, you know?
And so you could sort of see the whole movie as just her paranoia completely consuming her, and in the end she does something horrible. She lights her mother on fire because she thinks that her mother is the demon or the entity. And, you know, it could totally be read in that way of sort of, like, mental illness.
Yeah.
And just loss of touch with reality. But I feel like it can also totally be read in the way that this entity is 100% real in the context of this film. Yeah. And she called out to something and it listened.
Yeah.
and it totally manipulated her into doing something horrible. And that's like, when black magic comes back to you,
Yeah.
you know.
She got what she wanted in the worst way possible. But
Mm-hmm.
her mother is dead, but she did it herself. She killed
Yeah.
herself. Which could be like the curse, like being enacted exactly as it was meant to be. It was
yeah.
always gonna be, you know.
Totally. And I feel like something I was thinking about when we watched Suspiria, the remake recently, and something we were talking about with our roommates was the whole idea of the rituals in the film and how a lot of times they sort of enact these rituals without being certain, like, if they are going to work or how they are going to work.
Yeah.
And they end up not working a lot of the time. Like, there's so much, like, trial and error and so much error.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it's dark magic. It's black magic. And I think that is kind of, it's sort of explored in this film, in the way that, you don't really know the ins and outs of everything. You don't really know what this entity is, and the sort of, I think, paranoia and fear that, like, arises from it is, like, just being so uncertain that she's going to be safe from what she conjured.
Yeah, I think that, like, something that when I was reading about Adam McDonald's other film is it's like the idea that he is clearly interested in.
Sorry, I thought when you said Adam McDonald, I thought you said Adam McDonald. So I was like, when were you Adam McDonald's?
Adam McDonald.
No, I didn't.
Yeah. In his other film, Backcountry, it, like, seems like it's exploring, like, this same idea of, like, being powerless to something that you've gotten involved in that's just so much bigger than you, you know? And I feel like that is something, like, in this film, like, the whole time Leah is powerless, and she, like, turns to this thing that she's interested in, the occult, to try and, like, take control of her life, but it ultimately is just controlling another controlling force because she doesn't understand it. Like, it's so much bigger than anything, you know? It's so much bigger than just, like, her relationship with her mother. And
yeah, and I feel like that even goes along with her relationship with her mother, you know? It's like trying to add a sense of control in her life when I feel like, it works so well in the context of, like, a teenager, because it's like at a point when you're like, getting closer and closer to adulthood, and you like feel this need for, like, independence and freedom and free thought, but you can't have that yet. And she so badly, like, needs a sense of control and just can't get it from, like, any angle.
Yeah. And so she invites PYEWACKET to come and do her bidding.
Something I thought about, which is, like, it's kind of a stretch in a way, but something I was thinking about with, like, the differences in, like, her two rooms, because, there's her room before she moves and after she moves, and, like, there's even a part when her friend is like, aren't you gonna put up some posters or anything? But she, like, never does throughout the whole film, even though I'm sure she moved everything there.
Yeah.
But she never, like, makes her new room look like her old room. And I feel like I was just kind of thinking about, like, what that could mean.
It's something I was, like, actually thinking about too. Like, in the first house, like, the house looks so stark and, like, it's, like, really, like, bland, and there's, like, barely any photos on the walls. It looks, like, so stark except for her room, which is, like, full of, like, all the things she loves, like metal posters, and there's, like, stuff everywhere. There's books, and there's, like, music playing all the time.
Candles,
cool stuff, and
animals.
it's, like, really full of life in a way. Like, it's so full of her compared to the rest of the house, which seems, like, so stark, you know? Like, even her mother's room, like, is kind of, like, bland. There's, like, nothing in there except, like, a bottle of wine next to her bed, you know?
Yeah.
And then in the new house, yeah, she doesn't put up any pictures in her room at all. And I don't know, like maybe it's just like the idea that she's like found these things to cope with her grief, and she's like created a safe space for herself because her like mother wasn't there for her at the beginning, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then she's like removed from it, and it just like she's like it starts like this decline in her mental health that's like so much more severe because she's like been taken away from this like thing which was like keeping her sane, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I was kind of thinking about it in the way that like her old room kind of shows her identity. It kind of represents her identity, and I feel like because of just the emptiness of her new room, it almost feels like it could be like a reflection of like an emptiness of self. Like in a way, it leaves her open and vulnerable, and like
Yeah.
that's like why the spirit was able to come into her life. Um, but I don't know. It is kind of a stretch, but it's just like something I was thinking about. I guess something I was also thinking about as well was like the friends. I feel like there was something that kind of reminded me of like Freaks and Geeks, in the way that has she has this like loss in her life of somebody that she loved. And there's even this part when they're fighting, when her mom takes off her pentagram ring, and she's like, ever since your father died, you've been into that occult crap. And something I was kind of thinking about before then is, like, how long has she known these friends? And, like, how, has she, like, always been into metal music? Has she always been into the occult?
Yeah.
Or magic?
Yeah, I mean, her mother says, like, you're becoming a loser, like, all your friends are losers,
and so I feel like it's something that sort of happened after her loss, which I think is, like, really interesting, and that's what reminds me a lot of Freaks and Geeks with, like, Lindsay losing her grandfather and then, like, trying to sort of cope with her loss through being with people that she feel like could understand her in her sort of state of grief, state of like depression and things like that.
Yeah. I feel like the difference perhaps in this situation is that like it's like they make it clear that she lost her father and her mother has like not been there for her. Like her mother's a mess at the beginning, you know? And so I feel like with Lindsay it's like she's become like really disillusioned. But I feel like with Leah, it's like she just doesn't have anybody. Like she needs something, and like is totally alone. And so like I feel like there's so much more like attached to this like group of friends. Like there's so much more weight put on like the importance of these people. And I feel like the film does like a really good job at the beginning of like showing like how important they are.
Yeah. And I feel like as well that they're kind of a lot better friends than the kids are in Freaks and Geeks.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like there's so many times when, there's like this horrible thing that's happening to Leah throughout the entire film. Like, whether you want to believe that it's in her head or it's not, it's still horrible.
Yeah.
And her mother seems to take very little notice of it. Yeah. Even though she's like there to bandage up her cut on her wrist, and she'll be like, oh, like, why were you carrying around that knife? Like, I'm gonna hold on to it. Like, there's not any more questioning after that.
That is, like, one thing that I was, like, thinking about is that, like, there's, like, a scene, like, at the end where she's, like, hysterical, and her mother finds her in the attic, like, holding a knife with blood on her hands, like, crying. And she does so little. Like, she tries, I understand that maybe she can get Leah to talk, but then she, like, just leaves her alone, like, still in this distressed state, and, like, goes to bed. She's like, I'm just gonna take the knife. Like, I can't imagine reacting that same way. Like, if I found someone in such a state of confusion, to just, like, leave them, like, I feel like Leah, like, is, like, a victim of isolation and neglect in a lot of ways throughout the film. And, like, her friends, like, for example, like, are there for her. Like when she's like really says there's something going on, Janice is like, I believe you. Like I'm gonna come and stay with you. You know?
Yeah, I mean, there's like,
She just like defends her.
yeah, and like her other friend, like the super tall boy, is like, we're here for you.
You know, we want to help.
We want to help, which
Yeah.
is like something that like her mother never says.
Yeah.
Like even if she sort of changes her tune, if she's like remorseful for the things, she seems like so oblivious.
Yeah.
To what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Like another thing that I wanted to talk about is like there is this scene where Janice comes to stay with her, and there's like a scene in the film which I think is like really interesting because it's like of Janice sleeping on the sofa, and it's just like something like watching her, and you hear breathing. It's like a subjective shot of like breathing, looking over Janice. It's like not quite POV, but it like creates that feeling of like point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that's like interesting about it to me is it's literally like the only time in the whole film we're not with Leah.
Yeah.
So it makes me think that like maybe we are with Leah because it's like the one time in the movie that like this rule is broken, you know? It like doesn't fit with everything else. So I don't know, it makes me think that maybe we are with Leah in that moment because that's something I was thinking about in regards to like the whole idea of like, is this, you know, like the fantasy, like how is the curse being enacted? Like, is it real? Is it in her head?
Even like right after she does the ritual and she goes to bed and like she locks the door before she goes to bed and then she comes back down and it's open, like it could have been her in the middle of the night, you know?
Yeah.
But the door was locked. Like
That's
I feel like someone would have had to
Yeah.
come down.
And she does
unlock
sleepwalk later in the film.
Yeah.
So.
I think like also the ritual itself is like one of like the most like beautiful parts of the film, and in a way where it's like so stripped down. Like I feel like usually when I see rituals in films or TV shows, like they totally fulfill the fantasy of it. Like you believe that the magic is real because of how cinematic it is.
Yeah.
You know? And it's so weird because it's not really cinematic at all. It's like I feel like that's like one part in it where it feels like almost objective. You know? I feel like that's the only part where the camera feels really objective. You're just like watching her perform this ritual.
And it's like even the part where she's like gathering things, like she like pours the milk into the Tupperware, like it feels so like silly, like, you know.
But I feel like there's something where like you believe in it as well. I feel like that's what makes it so effective is like you're just watching a child like or a teenager performing this ritual. But it feels so foreboding. Like you really feel like she's doing something that she's gonna end up regretting. That's what makes you believe in the magic of the film.
Yeah, it was like, interesting watching the film with like two people that hadn't seen it because like I feel like they both had like no doubt that this magic has worked and was working, you know? And I feel like that is something that I also felt my first time watching it, you know, before you get to like the end.
Definitely. And I feel like, honestly, because we've seen it, what, like 3 times? Ish. And I probably didn't even think about, like, the possibility of it just being paranoia.
Yeah.
After the first watch. Like, I feel like I probably just 100% was like, PYEWACKET's real, you know?
There's, like, this scene, like, the very, very last scene when she's like with the detectives like after her mother has been burned and he's like there is no body we found like and he plays the voicemail of her like on the phone. You can hear her mother calling her in the background.
I think the effect that scene has is like not exactly to make you like question whether it was all in her head but to show the consequence because I feel like if she set her mother on fire and then her friend who she calls like when he picks her up, if he just like picks her up and you know Prince carries her into his car and then they drive away together, I feel like you would think that the ending is something that's more triumphant, you know? Like, she defeats the the devil and gets away and is okay. But I think having that scene of her facing these serious consequences for what happened, like, shows that what she conjured is coming back to her, you know?
Yeah.
I feel like something else I love is just, like, there's so many tiny things that coincide with the paranoia that happens after the ritual that I think are so great. Like, there's the one part when they go into that store that the mom wants to work for.
Yeah.
And there's, like, she's looking at the witch that's, like, hanging. And it's something you would not think about at all, you know? It's, like, just a little paper witch.
Yeah.
Because, like, Halloween is coming up. But, you know, when you have something in your head, it's, like, the whole idea of, you know, seeing it everywhere.
Yeah. And she sees the card, and it says,
yeah.
"Be careful what you wish for. Someone might be listening."
Which, like, is probably, like, some sort of, like, Christian card or something.
Yeah.
You know? But it has, like, such a different effect on her. Something else I noticed was when they were smoking outside, her and Janice were smoking outside of her house, and she was, like, talking about her mother's owls.
I thought the owls was interesting, too.
Yeah.
I, like, was looking up stuff about owls.
I did not even notice that.
Yeah, after she says the thing about the owls, like, I did start to notice them everywhere. They're, like, in the car, almost, like, every scene. There's, like, an owl. And I was looking up something about owls, and it was saying that they are, like, symbols of, like, good judgment. And they're also symbols of, like, change and transition. And so I thought that was interesting because I feel like a lot of this film is about just, like, the consequences of poor judgment, you know, and not being thoughtful.
Yeah, and I feel like sort of having these sort of, like, watchful eyes, like the eyes of, like, wisdom and truth and stuff, you know. Also, tiny little detail, but when she's trying to do the ritual again and she takes the milk carton out and it splashes onto the fridge, onto one of the shelves, and it's in, like, a demon shape.
Yeah.
Like, so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like there's just, like, what makes this film so successful is just, like, all of the little subtleties of it.
Yeah.
Like, it's like they didn't need to try so hard to scare you.
And I could see why, like, people might not like it because of that, because it is so subtle. But for me, like, I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I love a movie that, you know, you sort of discover more if you watch it again and again and again, you know. I guess I have, like, a little PYEWACKET history lesson, because I found a lot of interesting stuff. I read two articles. One was from this website called Strange Horizons. The other one is from this blog about New England folklore, which I've read a lot of other of their articles before. They have, like, a lot of really interesting stuff, so I would recommend checking out that blog.
What's it called?
New England folklore. A lot of it is about, like, the idea of familiars, because that's what PYEWACKET is. So before the late 1500s, magic was known to conjure up spirits, but it wasn't super connected with the idea of, like, these spirits taking, like, animal form. Like, there was the whole, like, King Solomon and, like, the Greater and Lesser Keys of Solomon, which were, like, about, like, different, like, spirits and entities and stuff. But it wasn't really about them, like, inhabiting animal forms. And there was also, like, the Malleus Maleficarum, which was this horrible book that was basically a witch hunting manual that kind of started all of the witch trials. And it briefly mentions witches taking the form of animals, but they don't really talk about, like, the word familiar or anything. And so the familiar spirit actually means servant entity, which I thought was really interesting in context to the film, because it's kind of like this spirit that is supposed to do your bidding. Because like I feel like thinking about it in the term of like an animal kind of doesn't make as much sense, but thinking about it in like a servant form seems to make more sense to the film. So there was like 3 women in 1563 that were accused during the British witch trials of worshipping the devil in the form of a cat, and the devil turned into a toad. And while in these animal forms, the devil fed from the blood of the witches. Like, this is sort of when the term familiar spirit first came to be. Was like in 1565 with the British witch trials with these witches. And the idea of a demonic animal feeding on witches' blood is an idea that's like continued through English and Scottish tradition, even up to the royals. So then there's King James VI of Scotland, who blamed witches for 2 unlucky sea voyages and an assassination attempt. And he became a super avid witch hunter after that and wrote his own sort of witch hunting manual called Demonology. And in there he links witches to certain types of animals, and it's because of his book that like the creatures have really bizarre names. And it's something that you can see in things like Shakespeare, things you could see in like Harry Potter. Matthew Hopkins was known as the Witchfinder General, and from 1644 to 1647, he instituted a succession of high-profile witch trials throughout England that resulted in the deaths of more people for witchcraft in those few years than the entire century before his beginning. And he claimed that a suspected witch could call upon her familiars. And he has a list of really fucking ridiculous names, which I'm gonna read for you because it's funny. So there was Holt, who was a white kitten. There was Jarmara, that was a fat legless spaniel. Vinegar Tom, a greyhound with the head of an ox. Sack and Sugar, which was a black rabbit. News, which was a polecat or ferret. And then there was a bunch of others that were like Elemanzer, Peckin the Crown, Grizzle, Greedy Gut, and PYEWACKET.
Vinegar Tom?
Vinegar Tom, that was my favorite one.
Why didn't they go with that for them?
Could you imagine if it was called Vinegar Tom? But he, like, claimed that the reason that the names were so nonsensical is because only the devil could have come up with them, but, like, clearly he came up with them because he's a sexist pig.
Yeah.
But another thing that I learned about reading through the New England folklore blog, which most of his information he got from A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Trials, and The American Experience, was that Hopkins most likely invented most of these names except for PYEWACKET. And the whole term PYEWACKET connects with this man named Darby Field. So he was an Irishman that came to New England in the 1630s, settled in New Hampshire around 1638. He worked as a ferryman, but he was like really interested in exploring the area around him. So he was like really interested in exploring like the Native American tribes and like speaking with them. And he even was able to speak the local Algonquin dialects, which I thought was really interesting. So in around 1642, he decided to climb the White Mountains and hired some local native guides from a village which he called PYEWACKET. It was his like rough English translation of what I cannot find the pronunciation to, but it's most likely PYEWACKET. And It was a name of one of the Abenaki groups that lived in New Hampshire and Maine. And his expedition was really well known at the time. It was in like Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop's journal and in a book by the explorer Ferdinando Gorges. And so it's really likely that Matthew Hopkins heard the term pigwacket from Darby Field and just incorporated it into the familiars with the weird names. And something that's just like very interesting and kind of typical about that is that the Puritans believed that Native Americans worshipped the devil. So it like makes a lot of sense that they would use their names as like demonic names for like familiar spirits and like demonic entities.
Yeah.
And so I just like found the whole thing super interesting because a lot of it sort of ends up like boiling down to xenophobia as per usual. But it's like really interesting that like a lot of these things, like, you know, nobody's heard of Vinegar Tom and nobody's heard of like a lot of these like ridiculous, you know, these ridiculous people who came up with these like horrible stories just to get rid of women. But some of these names have like lived on throughout history, and the term PYEWACKET has been like used in other media about witches and stuff, like calling upon it. So yeah, I feel like that's interesting, and I think that like especially it being like a Canadian film, like I'm sure I don't really know much about like why the director chose it, but I feel like probably just for the same reason that the director of Hereditary chose Payman, you know, King Payman. You know, it's like there's dozens of books about these familiar spirits, about demonic entities, about kings of hell. You know, they're all really interesting. And like if you were going to call upon someone that has the same sort of themes as like what you want to represent in your film, then it works really well. And like I don't really think that he chose it because of like the history of the persecution of women or because of like the history of Darby Field, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think he probably chose it because it sounds a lot cooler than Vinegar Tom.
Definitely. So, well, my first question was what happened to Janice? I just wanted to know your like interpretation or your theory.
I mean, I feel like my theory is that Leah did something to her. You know, whether that's because she was like being possessed by the spirit or it was mental illness, like I'm not sure. But I think that's what it is. Kind of from what I said before about the idea of like everything, we're always with Leah, you know, in this film, and this is like the one time where we're not. But we probably still are. And also just her reaction, she's like clearly just very upset, but she's also like, she says, "Don't touch me." And she's like waiting in the car after this incident, and she won't go back in the house, and she's like, "Don't touch me," you know? Yeah, I mean, and she doesn't speak to her at all after that, you know? It makes me think that it is something with her because she came up there saying, like, you know, not a lot scares me, like, looking for something. And I understand, like, her being traumatized by it, but I feel like just, like, her being completely unwilling to communicate with her afterwards, like, she won't, like, speak to her, she doesn't want her to touch her, she won't answer her texts. I feel like it makes me think that it was to do with Leah. And also I feel like if you, like, are following this, like, if you 100% believe in PYEWACKET existence within the film, it, like, would also tie in that Leah had done something to her because, like, that's how the curse is unfolding. Like, you know, all the consequences are put onto Leah. So.
Totally. My next question is, what do you think the forest represents?
I feel like the forest really just represents, like, isolation. And, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, like, forests are obviously, like, notoriously spooky. And I was thinking about this. Like, there's like the idea of like urbanoia, which is like when people like leave civilization, go into the wilderness, which is like
Yeah.
obviously something that this director explored in his last film because it's all about like nature survival, like being lost in the woods with like bears chasing you. And so there's like this like the scene like early on where they're going to see the new house and they're just like driving into like the wilderness like on this like long road. There's like no other cars, just trees, and that's like super like um, typical of like any kind of urban noir film. You see people like leaving civilization, and so I think like that's really what the wilderness represents in this film, and also just like the idea of like things being so much bigger than you, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like dark magic. It's sort of like you don't know what you're playing with.
Yeah,
It's like this unstoppable force.
definitely. And then my last question was, what do you think was the best cinematography in the film? Like the most interesting shot or something?
Mm-hmm. Um, I think that it's like kind of like a random scene, but like my favorite piece of cinematography in the movie is like the scene where um, she's like come back from the ritual and her wrist is bleeding, and she like rushes to the bathroom and she's like trying to wash her wrist, and her mother is like at the door, and then she like opens it, and the camera is like it's like shaking with her, and it's like kind of like moving all around like in a really human way, and there's like a part when her mother opens the door, the camera, it's as if someone like has picked it up and is like now pointing it at the door with her mother coming in.
Mm.
And I really like that because I feel like I just really like the handheld in this film because I feel like it really does, like it's so human, feels so real, you know. It feels like you're in there. You're like you're holding the camera or something. You're in there with her, and yeah,
Yeah. And I think that's something that's kind of interesting about that is like when there are shots that are like drone shots or crane shots or something, you can feel a sort of like robotic touch to it.
mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's something really interesting that you were saying is like it has such a human touch, which I feel like grounds it within this film, you know, with like all this idea of magic and nature
Yeah.
and like femininity and stuff. Yeah, those are my
Okay.
questions.
So my first question is, what's your favorite scene and least favorite scene?
Um, Good question. I feel like I have like two favorite scenes. One of them is like the ritual, just because I think it's so cool, and then the other one is at the end when everything sort of builds up to her coming up more face to face with uh, with PYEWACKET, and she runs outside, and the creature just like slinks out from like the side of her house,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just like so inhuman. Its legs like sort of flop over to the front of it, and especially like all the things I was talking about before with like the success of it being so far away but still being just so terrifying.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't need to be like running all the way up to the camera to make you afraid, because like you know how big of a threat it is because of the context of the entire film, and just sort of seeing it from far away is like sort of seems to ground it in the reality of the film.
Yeah. And also just the idea of like sort of your eyes playing tricks on you when you're like alone in the dark, like
Oh,
especially
totally.
like we're both like staying in a place which is quite secluded and there's lots of trees, and at night it's just pitch black outside and
Yeah.
it can be spooky, and
Yeah, I feel like I see weird figures all the
yeah,
time.
so it feels like really real in that way. Okay, my next question is, if you had to like definitively say, like, do you think that the curse is real or is all in her head?
Um, I mean, I am here for the fantasy, so I love believing in spirits. So I would definitely say that I lean more towards it being real,
Mm-hmm.
in the reality of the film.
Yeah. And my next question is, if people like PYEWACKET, what would be like the next film you recommend and why?
Ooh. I feel like I can think of three, and unfortunately, all of them have male protagonists
Mm-hmm.
because I feel like this is honestly um, something that's just not really explored well with female protagonists, which is why I love this movie so much.
Mm-hmm.
But I think ones that are like similar to it, not necessarily always in a supernatural way, but just the idea of like dealing with grave consequences, I would say is Super Dark Times. So, Super Dark Times, the IMDb description is teenagers Zach and Josh have been best friends their whole lives. But when a gruesome accident leads to a cover up, the secret drives a wedge between them and propels them down a rabbit hole of escalating paranoia and violence. And I think it has a very similar structure to PYEWACKET in the way that there's something that sort of cannot be undone that happens a lot closer to the beginning of the film. And it's about the sort of consequences and paranoia in dealing with this thing that happened that propel the rest of the story. And so I feel like if you like the sort of structure of that, you would really like this film. And then another one is Daniel Isn't Real. So it's about troubled Luke suffers a violent family trauma and resurrects his childhood imaginary friend to help him cope. Charismatic and full of energy, Daniel helps Luke to achieve his dreams before pushing him into a desperate fight for his own soul. So, something that I feel like is really comparative to PYEWACKET is sort of the idea that this film can be read in the same two ways. You can sort of look at the entire film as a metaphor for mental illness and paranoia, and just like the deterioration of the mind. Um, or you can read it as a fantasy with some sort of entity and like the power struggle between those two. The last one, it's a movie by Gus Van Sant called Paranoid Park. So it's basically about this kid. He's like a young teenager named Alex, and he loves skateboarding. And he likes to go to this place, Paranoid Park, which is a skate park that a bunch of crust punks hang out at. And he sort of looks up to them and admires them. And he ends up sort of doing something similar, like with PYEWACKET and with Super Dark Times that can't be undone. And it's about him sort of dealing with the paranoia and the consequences of his actions. And it's super subjective, just like PYEWACKET is. You're in his mind the entire time, and he writes diary entries because he feels like he has nobody to talk to about his experience. So a lot of it is like his own narration of his inner turmoil, and it's wonderful.
Those are good picks. I guess like I would have two films I would recommend next. And the first one would be The Witch. Like it's like set in puritanical New England, and it's about this like family, and the eldest daughter is suspected of witchcraft. And I feel like it has like very like atmospheric, slow burn kind of feel. And it's like
Definitely.
also like another female protagonist, and there's witchcraft, and so I feel like that's a good film to watch by Robert Eggers. And then the second film I recommend is I'm Not a Serial Killer, which is directed by Billy O'Brien. And it's about a troubled teen with homicidal tendencies has to hunt down and destroy a supernatural killer while suppressing his own inner demons. One thing about this film that's so great is like all those like a lot of our films that we just recommended that are really similar to this are like with male protagonists, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like it's really cool. It's like a film where there's like a female protagonist who's just like into metal, you know?
Yeah. People think that it's more relatable for men to act impulsively and then have to deal with the consequences of that, especially when it has to do with, like, violence. And I don't think that's true at all. And so it's really nice to have a film where a female character acts impulsively out of rage and pain and deals with the consequences of that, because I feel like I've done that as a woman. I feel like you've done that as a woman. I feel like most women I know have done impulsive things from dark places.
Yeah. And just, like, the idea of, like, a film exploring so deeply, like, when people say things that they wish they could take back.
Totally. Which I think is just, that's just human experience, you know? It's not gendered whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hope you enjoyed our first podcast.
I'm Natalie.
I am Marika.
Peace. Peace out.
Later, Hosen.